started. Okay, there we go. Nancy H. Hornberger, Professor Emerita at the University of Pennsylvania, USA, is an internationally recognized educational linguist and anthropologist researching multilingual education, policy and practice in immigrant, refugee, and indigenous communities. A prolific author and editor, recent publications include an annotated bibliography on educational linguistics in Oxford Bibliographies in Linguistics. Prof. Hornberger, it is an honor for us to have you here. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and a special thanks to Sinfree and all of the organizers really for being patient until we could actually make this happen. It's been a few years, I think, in the making, so I'm very pleased to be here finally, and also with this distinguished group of scholars and colleagues, and that some of whom I'm meeting for the first time now. So I will now try to start the share screen. I do have some slides to share, and I will see if I can make this happen. Let's see, I want to do the PowerPoint. I want to do. Does that look correct? Can you see it?
Yes, we can.
All right, good. Yes.
We can also see the writing below, Prof, if you wanted to.
Oh, okay.
Depends on you.
Now, how did that happen? I thought I got it correct, but I guess I didn't. Let's do it again. So this is. Why is it doing that? Is that presenter view? No.
No.
All right, let's escape.
Now it works.
I thought I had set this all up. You see?
Oh,
now it works.
It went
amazing. All right. So now you've got just the slide?
no, we went back to the comments.
Oh my goodness. I'm gonna quit and start again. So we're in Zoom. Screen sharing has stopped. I'm gonna stop share. Oh, it already has stopped. Okay. So I don't have Chanel and Phoebe and Magda here to help me get this set up. See, just me. View, presenter view. No, maybe I don't want presenter view. Now, how does that look? You can't see it.
Sinfree, you are muted.
Chanel, if Nancy sends you her PowerPoints, can you control them from your side?
I can do that, Prof. We can use that as one solution if it doesn't work out.
Nancy, you do actually need the presenter's view.
Okay.
Let's see.
But when I'm doing it, it's showing you the notes, right?
It's very strange. Okay, go down, and the last icon on the right before the minus, I think, should work. No. That's strange. This is strange.
But it's strange because I think in the past I've been able to do it. And
usually that's the way it works.
For some reason it keeps going. You have it briefly and then it goes away again?
Yeah,
I'm trying to find the little magic box that lets me.
You choose the screen, of course, whether you want if you have a monitor, you click on the screen that's going to do it. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I think you may have solved the problem. Let's see. Let me escape again. So I don't click on my PowerPoint, I click on desktop. Is that what you're saying? When I'm going to share? Portion of screen, that's what I want. Yeah.
Right. Probably.
Okay.
Now let's see what happens.
No,
What happened this time?
zooms in very close on only one aspect of your PowerPoint.
I'm so sorry. You would think that I'm that I've never done this before, but I actually have. Partly it must be because I'm working from well, let me send my PowerPoint to Chanel.
Yeah.
Actually, it's working now.
Can you skip to the next slide, Prof. Hornberger? Let's just see if it works. If you skip.
Let's see, I have to start it, I think.
Sure.
How could I do this? No, it's not. Oh.
No, you can't. You know, it doesn't seem to work.
I'm screen sharing. I have my laptop and I have the camera attached. I have a desktop screen, no, I mean a display, and I'm working from both so I can see it. And that may be what's causing the problem. So I'm sorry about this, everybody.
No problem.
Okay.
Phoebe, I was wondering, maybe it helps if you make Professor Hornberger the co-host. Maybe there's some configuration issues. Maybe that will help.
Yeah, we made Prof. Hornberger co-host.
You already were? I already was?
You are now.
You are now.
Oh, all right. Well, let's see if that helps. All right. So screen sharing.
So, Professor Hornberger, you can stop your screen share. Oh, yeah.
Thanks. So I can start it again, right? Now that I'm a co-host.
Wait.
I'm so sorry. No, I don't want to leave the meeting because that will.
Do you want to send it to me, Prof. Hornberger, and then I can just, you can just let me know when to shift to the next one.
Yeah.
All right, let's try that.
Sure.
I almost did that earlier this morning, but then I thought I had gotten it working. So, oh well. Here it comes. It's gone, so hopefully it'll arrive shortly.
It will get there shortly.
Let's just pause the recording maybe for a while.
All right. So again, thank you all for being here and inviting me. It really is a wonderful opportunity for me. And I hope we'll have time for interchange, especially after all this time I wasted with the technical. Yeah. Okay, So I will tell you a few stories about things I have learned in my work with Indigenous communities, language activists, and educators over the past 4 decades. Why stories? I'm an ethnographer, and stories are our stock in trade. As an ethnographer of language policy and multilingual education, my questions have always been about how to best serve language minoritized learners in our schools, and how best to support the flourishing of minoritized language communities' ways of speaking, being, doing through our education systems and practices. Language minoritized learners are those who bring to school languages or ways of speaking other than the dominant or official school language, including refugees, immigrants, speakers of non-standard or indigenous languages. It is not necessarily about being a minority in numbers, but about being minoritized by inequality of status and inequity of treatment, often across multiple generations. I've been interested in the experiences of all language minoritized learners and communities, but perhaps most of all, Indigenous learners and ways of speaking, doing, being, ever since I lived and worked with Quechua speakers in the South American Andes in the 1970s. Back to my stories. I want to clarify that ethnographers' stories are not random anecdotes of passing incidents, or even journalistic accounts based on fairly rapid fact-checking and interviewing of experts on breaking news events. Rather, they are the fruit of painstaking, detailed, and often long-term participant observation, interviewing, and document collection in specific places, be they communities or classrooms, real or virtual, one or multiple, with the goal of understanding, analyzing, and interpreting people's ways of speaking, doing, being, thinking, and feeling in that place. Importantly, the ethnographer's quest is to understand from an inside perspective, which requires constant and sometimes exhausting attention, reflection, cross-checking, and most of all, humility and respect. The ethnographer's stories are also informed, of course. Chanel, are you able to move it ahead?
Yes, I think she is.
Yes, is this the right
Yes.
one?
So come forward, go forward a little bit more. One, two.
No, yeah,
So I did that. Okay, we're here.
yeah.
And so I should indicate to you when
Sure.
we shift.
Sure.
Yeah, okay. Since you don't know what's coming. So the ethnographer's stories are also informed, of course, by the ethnographer's own ways of speaking, doing, being, thinking, and feeling. Oh, I guess this is actually the preceding slide. You can show it. Oops. Yeah, that one. As well as by a store of theoretical and empirical research. In my case, research on bilingualism and bilingual education, sociolinguistics, anthropology of education, language policy and planning, and Indigenous language revitalization. Fields to which I have over the years also added my own studies and conceptual frameworks. The stories I tell here then, each one from a different decade and place, mostly from South America, where I have worked longest, are not just about that place and time, but about lessons I have seen repeated in other times and places, including South Africa, New Zealand, Paraguay, and Mexico, informed also by the conceptual framework I've developed and worked with, written and published about, which has also been taken up by others and which I won't go into here, though it underlies the lessons from my stories. Called The Continuum of Biliteracy, or COBI, as Bassi so nicely dubbed it, and its context, media, content, and development. Next slide. The stories and lessons I'll tell you about are about these 4 lessons or themes that I want to highlight, and I'll go into them in more detail as we proceed, but ideological and implementational spaces, multilingual, multimodal language ecologies, reclaiming Indigenous ways, and language and voice. So we'll start with ideological and implementational spaces. Next slide. At Cayarani School in Bolivia, this is a valley above Cochabamba, Bolivia. Next slide. A new building has been inaugurated the year before I visited, which was August 2000, and the classrooms were welcoming. You can see in the picture the older building on the right and the newer building on the left. Next slide. The classrooms were welcoming with tables and chairs set up for group work, a welcome change from ubiquitous rows of 3 students per desk or pupitre, facing forward to the teacher in the traditional Highland school. Teacher Berta, next slide, had been there 3 years, implementing bilingual intercultural education under the 1994 Bolivian National Education Reform, and her classroom was decorated with her handmade posters in Quechua, showing models of a story, a poem, a song, a recipe, a letter, as well as both the Quechua and Spanish alphabets. Next slide. Also on the wall was the class newspaper, Yaxtacapari, the Voice of the People, featuring an article in Quechua written by student Calestino, the one on the left here, about farmers wanting better prices for their potatoes, their community's subsistence. Next slide. In a library corner housing the 80-book library provided by the reform through UNESCO auspices, there were 6 big books in Spanish. You can see 2 of them here. 3 based on Indigenous oral traditions. 2 children noticed my interest in the big books and gleefully held them up for a photo when the rest of the class left for recess. So that's my little story. Bolivia's 1994 education reform sought to implant bilingual intercultural education nationwide, incorporating all 30 Bolivian indigenous languages, beginning with the 3 largest, Quechua, Aymara, and Guarani, which were also the languages whose oral traditions were included in these big books. The new law had massively expanded the reach of EIB, or Educación Intercultural Bilingüe, from around 100 experimental schools in the early 1990s to almost 3,000 schools by the early 2000s, reaching at that point 22% of the primary school population and yielding higher rates of graduation and lower school desertion rates. The reform clearly, next slide, sorry. The reform clearly opened ideological and implementational spaces for the practice of multilingual Indigenous education, as at Cairani, where teacher Berta actively embraced and creatively put into practice the Bolivian reform's multilingual pedagogy. But in other rural Bolivian schools, untouched stacks of the reform's texts remained in locked cabinets in the director's office, and little effort was made to implement EIB. Top-down policies may open up ideological and implementational spaces, but it is local actors who fill those spaces when they appropriate, interpret, and at times resist or expand beyond policy initiatives. Quote, local educators are not helplessly caught in the ebb and flow of shifting ideologies in language policies. They help develop, maintain, and change that flow. That's a quote from an article by me and my student, David Johnson. So the next, now the next lesson that I've learned is, we can move to the next slide, multilingual, multimodal language ecologies. And I take you to, as I say there, the Brazilian Amazon in the late 1990s. Every year since 1983, an Indigenous teacher education course sponsored by the Comissão Pro Índio do Acre in Rio Branco, Brazil, in the northeast, has been held during the southern hemisphere's summer months, January to March, in the Amazonian rainforest of Brazil. At the 1997 session I attended, there were some 25 profesores indios, or indigenous teachers, representing 8 different ethnic groups whose languages varied in their vitality, some with 150 speakers and others with several thousand. These teachers had traveled, in some cases for a week, by canoe to get to the rainforest site where they spent several weeks or really 3 months with their colleagues in this course that was both their own learning of pedagogy and curriculum and Portuguese also, but also they were teachers in formation. They're already teaching in their communities and they're coming to for continuing professional education, basically. And after many years, the program, the Comissão Pro Índio do Acre, was able to get approval from the Brazilian Ministry of Education for these teachers to then be certified. But when I was there, that had not yet happened. A striking feature of the course was the mutual multilingual understanding among the professores. Their indigenous languages were not only encouraged and used as medium and subject of instruction in the course and later in their own schools, but also the professores encouraged and exchanged among each other across their different languages. Even if they did not necessarily speak or understand all the other languages spoken and written by their peers. They read, listened, and looked at each other's work. To facilitate mutual understandings, they at times used Portuguese as lingua franca, at times drew on the geometric designs that were an integral part of their writing. You can show the next slide here. And at times simply relied on their shared intra and interethnic experiences. This multimodal, mutual, multilingual comprehension was particularly striking given the great diversity of languages in the group and the salience of multimodal drawing and geometric design in their writing practices. Each written assignment bore the complex and colorful geometric designs and maps that are, as Brazilian scholars Nieta Monte and Lin Mario Menezes de Souza, Lin Mario Menezes de Souza demonstrate, not merely illustrations to accompany the alphabetic text, but integral complements to it. And these multimodal expressions contributed to the Indigenous teachers' mutual understanding across language differences, as well as to the development of their writing in those languages and in Portuguese. Next slide. Communicative repertoires in Indigenous education go beyond multilingual speaking and writing to include also graphic, artistic, gestural, kinesic, digital, and other communicative modes. The multimodal, multilingual language ecologies characterizing language learning and teaching practices in these spaces offers potential to strengthen each individual participant's linguistic repertoire while simultaneously fostering peer interaction and cooperative learning. Maybe I'll have time to mention this later if it comes up. So the next lesson and story, we can move along. Reclaiming Indigenous Ways. PROIB Andes is PROIB stands for Programa de Educación Intercultural Bilingüe para los Andes, PROIB Andes. Is a master's program in bilingual intercultural education for Indigenous students at the University of San Simón in Cochabamba, Bolivia. That's, you see here, one of the entrances to that university, which was created in the ideological and implementational space of the 1994 reform. In September 2004, I did a series of workshops on ethnographic research methods with the 4th cohort. Next slide. Consisting of 42 students from 6 Andean countries and at least a dozen different Indigenous language backgrounds. For our final unit, I told them about the Indigenous research agenda proposed by Maori researcher Linda Tuiwai Smith in her book, Decolonizing Methodologies. And you can show the next slide, where she talks in terms of 4 tides or conditions in which Indigenous people live: survival, recovery, development, and self-determination; 4 directions or processes through which they move: healing, decolonization, mobilization, and transformation; and 25 projects Indigenous people undertake, such as reclaiming, renaming, remembering, revitalizing, networking, and so on. Smith's metaphor of tides is very much based in the Maori island ocean ecology. So I wasn't sure how it would go over with this group of mostly highland Andean Indigenous educator researchers I was working with. Next slide. It turned out they were extremely attentive, avidly taking notes and showing clear moments of resonance and response. They really buzzed among themselves when I mentioned the project Smith calls Connecting, and told of her example of reinstituting the traditional Maori practice of burying the afterbirth after the child is born. Indeed, in Maori, the word for afterbirth and earth is the same. Students again resonated when I mentioned Smith's Indigenous project of renaming places and people with their original Indigenous names, and spontaneously came up with their own examples. They mentioned how Amazonian Aguarunas are reclaiming their own name, Awahun, for example. At the end, I asked the group, ¿Qué les parece? What do you think? And they immediately responded, Estamos con la Linda. They claimed her first name even. We're really with Linda. Resoundingly endorsing the framework and embracing the researcher on a first name basis. So that was in 2004. Indigenous educators participating in the workshop resonated with Linda Smith's notion of connecting in the sense of connecting people to each other and to the earth. Next slide. When in later interviews, I asked these educators what it means to them to be Indigenous, the first and most prominent responses were about living close to the land, speaking one's native language, and experiencing discrimination by others for doing so. These themes about affirmation of one's own ways of being, doing, and speaking, and at the same time experiencing discrimination by others for those very practices, were foremost in the collective story of these individuals' experiences of and reflections about being Indigenous. Next slide. Envisioning and building an Indigenous future was another theme that resonated with the Andean educators, closely linked to reclaiming their locally rooted practices, renaming their world, and revitalizing their Indigenous identities. Summing up his sense of what it means to him to be Indigenous, Moises, a Peruvian Aymara from Puno and Lima, touched on reclaiming, reaffirming, and revitalizing Indigenous ways. He said in Spanish, "For me, being Indigenous means identifying with my ethnic people, our past, our history, our worldview, our language. In the present, working to reclaim our rights, being actively committed, and in the future, projecting that our ethnic people might have a future with equality of opportunities with other peoples of our country." Moises' commitment is to take and use his present graduate studies to improve the lives of his people, drawing on their collective past to project toward the future, which in fact he has done. He went on to do exactly that. Through both lived experience and intellectual study, he and his peer Indigenous educators are fully aware of the enormous structural obstacles and historical oppressions they face, and they consciously choose the path of transformational resistance. Next slide. Often at great personal cost, in the sense that Brayboy highlights in relation to American Indian students in the US, Brian Brayboy. They opt to, as another ProAbe student says, aprovechar el espacio que el Estado nos da, exploit the space the nation state gives us, through multilingual education to work toward the future equality and dignity of their people and thereby of all people. Next slide. Indigenous education affords spaces for reclaiming, reaffirming, and revitalizing Indigenous ways of speaking, doing, being, thinking, and feeling. It is about choice, as foremost US scholar of Native American education, Teresa McCarty writes, quote, "Choice lies at the heart of contests over Indigenous sovereignty, self-determination, and linguistic human rights. Denial of the right to choose educational approaches, particularly media of instruction, is the trademark of colonial regimes," unquote. So the last lesson and story is language and voice. We can turn to that one. This takes us to Sweden, to Sapmi, which is really a multinational area that is the homeland of the Sami people. Sweden, Norway, Finland, parts of Russia. Their name, it's their own name for their area, for their territory. Multimodal, multilingual communicative practices stood out to me as I learned about Sami language revitalization classes taught out of the Sametinget Sami Parliament Språkcentrum in Östersund, Sweden. So this is a picture of the Sami Parliament building in Östersund, and within that, we visited the Språkcentrum, which is the language center. These are both ideological and implementational spaces opened up in part by legislative recognitions of Sami rights in Sweden beginning in the 1980s and appropriated here by 2 language teachers appointed by the Sami Parliament, whom I visited with a colleague in 2013. Next picture. In the 2 teachers' accounts of their Yeglo materials production, their mentor program, and their language barrier project, a variety of materials and modalities emerged, including multilingual word cards for preschools, cooking and handcraft classes and activities, theater and tourist office visits, and language network map making with adult heritage language learners. Yet most memorable in their accounts was what they called the process of tears and the pain they found themselves working through with the elders and adults enrolled in their classes. They told us of the memories, anger, and shame their heritage learners felt for having learned not to speak Sami, and of the resistance they met from their own families as they struggled to overcome their own internal language police, in their words, to speak. Resistance that arose sometimes from the learners' own grown children who themselves resented not having been raised to speak Sami. The teacher's story was a moving account of how these passive speakers became active speakers. Next slide. As they became a strong and supportive group. In the teacher's words, they learned as a group, they rose as a group. This experience of the relationship between language and voice brought me back to my own PhD research on the Peruvian Altiplano in the 1980s, another indigenous context of sociohistoric and sociolinguistic oppression. Next slide. Where I had observed one little girl in both classroom and home settings. This little 7-year-old who's standing there at the back in her pink shirt and red sweater. Rarely, if ever, spoke in class, despite being in a bilingual Spanish Quechua classroom. If you can see the blackboard, there's 2 lists of words. On the left is in Spanish and on the right is in Quechua, which was actually not the pedagogy of the program, but the teacher's own invented pedagogy, where he wanted to constantly present the children with both versions of the pedagogy at that time was much more language separation, but he was really already language mixing because he was an experienced teacher, so knowledgeable, so wonderful to sit in his classroom, and this is what he did. In any case, the classroom was bilingual, but she rarely spoke. But at home, next slide, she was a live wire. She talked nonstop to me in Quechua, telling me all about the names and ages of her whole family. But that picture shows her with her brother and my two children, who were quite small at that time. They're now in their 40s, so that gives you a sense of the time here. She talked nonstop to me in Quechua, telling me all about the names and ages of her whole family, showing me the decorations on the wall of her home, the blankets woven by her grandmother, borrowing my hat. All this while she jumped on the bed, did somersaults, cared for her 2 baby brothers, and so on. Then, as now, it struck me that this little girl, whom I call Basilia, lost her voice at school and found it at home, and that use of her own language in familiar surroundings was key in the activation of her voice. Next slide. Voice was not just about using Quechua in the classroom, but being in active dialogue with her environment. Language and voice are related but it is also important to distinguish between them. As my mentor, Richard Ruiz, wrote, quote, language has a life of its own. It exists even when it is suppressed. When voice is suppressed, it is not heard, it does not exist. To deny people their language is, to be sure, to deny them voice, but to allow them, quote, their language is not necessarily to allow them voice, unquote. When classroom practices are effective in fostering dynamic development of Indigenous learners' language and literacy, it is perhaps because of using their language in ways that mediate voice, as expressed through dialogism, meaning making, and access to wider discourses, and taking an active stance. These are all drawn from work, though my themes there are drawn from work by Lev and Holland on voice, Bakhtinian notions of voice. Across the world, in another Indigenous context, next slide, of multilingual, multimodal classroom practice, this one, a dual language honors undergraduate program at University of Limpopo in South Africa, using both English and the local Indigenous African language Sepedi. Program founder Michael Joseph wrote, in the next slide, you'll see a picture of Michael Joseph. He wrote that it's a kind of learning that is at once about discovering their culture and the great ideas in the literature, one unlocking the other. This, I have written more at length about this program, but here I'm just mentioning it quickly to reinforce this idea that Indigenous voices, when they're activated through Indigenous languages, when they're activated through voice of the speakers, are really a powerful force for enhancing learning and for sustaining Indigenous ways of speaking, doing, being, thinking, and feeling. Now back to Umeå University, you can go next slide, where I've been visiting professors since 2012. Personal accounts by Sami colleagues document their own and their families' experiences of discrimination in, for example, histories of Sami schooling or contestation over land rights, or, oh, sorry, next slide. And next slide after that. There you go. Here's what I'm reading so that you can follow it a little better. It's a long list. So they documented their own and their families' experiences of discrimination in histories of Sami schooling, contestation over land rights, political divisions among Sami themselves, and the challenges of teaching combined classes of heritage and non-heritage Sami speakers. These are some of the challenges that they have highlighted in their own work. These colleagues have also taken up the implementational spaces opened by recent 2000 and 2009 minority languages legislation for Sami language in Sweden to enact activities which I've listed here, designing curricula and teaching materials for Sami language teaching, including distance and virtual learning spaces, engaging in advocacy for Sami immersion in primary education in their municipality of Umeå, undertaking a Sápmi multilingual literacies research project across Sweden, Norway, and Finland, serving on the Swedish Sami School Council, developing and advocating for a Sami language teacher education proposal, mentoring Sami PhD students, and designing PhD research projects toward collaborative action research in Sami primary school. Hanna Otokoski, the next slide, a North Sami speaker who was a PhD student and lecturer in North Sami when I started in 2012 and has since completed her PhD and has become a powerful voice, an articulate voice for Sami language revitalization, not just in many of the projects I listed, but across all of Sápmi in Finland, Norway, and Sweden. So my final comment, Indigenous educators' experiences in language revitalization as told in these stories are both profoundly different from and profoundly the same as those of other multilingual educators. The contested and highly politicized nature of Indigenous education and language revitalization is familiar to those engaged in multilingual education efforts in minoritized language communities everywhere. Yet these stories of Indigenous educators and language activists filling up and expanding on ideological and implementational spaces opened up by top-down policies, enacting multimodal, multilingual language learning and teaching practices, reclaiming Indigenous ways of speaking, doing, being, thinking, and feeling, and activating Indigenous voices, speak eloquently of the possibilities for constructing more just and democratic societies in our globalized and intercultural world. It is in their advocacy for the oppressed, and Indigenous peoples are arguably the most deeply oppressed of all peoples, that Indigenous education and language revitalization are so politically controversial, and at the same time, why they offer so much hope for a better and more just future for all peoples. And that's what I wanted to share with you and hope to open conversation.
Thank you so much for this very wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. So I would now like to hand over to Professor Makoni to begin conversations with you.
Thank you very much, Nancy. I have a couple of questions, but they are framed more in the sense of trying to initiate a conversation between you, me, and hopefully with the rest of the global community that has been listening to you. As a matter of interest, if one of your students was to write your biography and they wanted to ask you, why did you finally end up going to South America to research Indigenous language revitalization? Why South America? Why not Philadelphia? Why not Asia? What led you in that direction? Mm-hmm.
So, okay. Thank you for that question. And I always say to my students, that's often something that they ask me.
Yeah.
And I usually say, well, there's the short version and the long version. Let me see if I can do something somewhere in between, okay. So we don't spend the rest of the time telling the story. Okay. So I grew up in a mainstream family in Northern California, mm-hmm. English speaking. We were all English speaking. I went to the local elementary school, Kent School in Kentfield, California, and I always mention both my family context, which was very, I think the only way to say it is very interculturally and internationally minded from mm-hmm. the beginning, but mm-hmm. also my 5th grade teacher, who was white, I think Jewish. Miss Lohenberg was her name. Mm-hmm. I've tried to track her down, never succeeded. But she offered to teach Spanish early in the morning before school started to mm-hmm. anyone who would come. And I did that. I don't know whether I volunteered or my parents volunteered me or she volunteered me. I don't know. But she had, as I've reconstructed it in my mind, she had taken a course over the summer in audiolingual method. This was the mm-hmm. heyday of the audiolingual mm-hmm. method. And she wanted to try it with her students, with her 5th grade students. So she had a group of us coming early in the morning, 8:30 every morning, and she would have these reel-to-reel tapes, and we'd have these headphones. And so that was my start with Spanish. And I had also, growing up in Northern California, had been exposed to Spanish in the environment, in the place names, and although they were badly pronounced, like Los Angeles and so forth. But so there was a tendency there to Spanish is what I'm getting at. And that kind of continued. In high school, I studied Spanish and so forth. So that, I think, got me started with why maybe Spanish-speaking parts of the world. But I think also the orientation that my parents had instilled throughout my life to sort of be open to intercultural and international experiences and people and ways of being. So then, I guess a couple more highlights. One is in high school, I applied to be an exchange student, and I was like many high school students of my cohort. I thought, oh, it would be nice to go to France. I had, at that point, I started French in high school too, you know, high school dreams of the romantic friends, or I don't know what it was, but I thought maybe I'd go to France. And the Youth for Understanding program that accepted me said, well, how about would you go to Uruguay instead, because you've studied more Spanish? And I said, okay, I'll go to Uruguay. And then, but what happened in the interim was that my mom, who sort of made a friendship with the director of this program, who was in Ann Arbor, Michigan. They had long telephone conversations. And eventually that person said, would you be willing to accept a student from Brazil in your home before Nancy goes to Uruguay? Because we have a group coming from Brazil and we'd really like to place them. And so my mom said, yes. So we had Sandra Miranda from Rio de Janeiro stay in our home. And that was just the 6 months prior to when I was going to go to Uruguay. And while she was there, she said, well, you know what? My parents are also going to host students in the summer when they come. How about if Nancy comes to my house? So anyway, to make a long story short, I went to Brazil, not France, not Uruguay, but Brazil. And had a really, I was 16 years old. That was a great immersion experience in the language, the culture. Just a whole new world. I do remember many conversations with Brazilians about the race problem in the US. And they were all saying, we don't have a race problem here. You know, why do you have that race problem in the US? And even then I thought that was a little bit off, but I was a good listener and, you know, tried to hold up my end of the conversation at 16 years of age, which was not a lot. And so then, in college then, I guess I'm not doing this very quickly, but I met my future husband, we've just celebrated 50 years of marriage last year, who was very interested in the Andes. He had been a boy choir singer and had toured the South America at the age of 12 with the Columbus Boy Choir. This was part of I believe an Eisenhower program that was about cultural exchange. And he had fallen in love with the Andes at that stage, and it's been a lifelong thing for him. So we met in a Portuguese class at Harvard. He was in the divinity school and I was an undergrad. And one thing led to another, and here we are. So he sort of drew me more to the Andean side of things. And in college, I did another exchange, which was like a volunteer work in Arequipa, Peru. And then in that community outside of Arequipa, where I was doing work in the school, that it was a migrant community from Quechua-speaking areas of the highlands. And so that was my first acquaintance with Quechua and Quechua speakers. And then later, when Steve and I married, and then he had trained as a Lutheran pastor, but he had always really wanted to work as a missionary. So he was in conversation with the Lutheran Board of Missions, and we did eventually go. And that's where I first really learned Quechua, really was immersed in the Andes in the 1970s as the missionary wife of my husband, the missionary. During those years in Peru, the Quechua officialization law was passed, 1975. Same year actually the same day our daughter was born. We still have the newspaper. It doesn't announce her birth, it only announces the Quechua officialization. And, but we witnessed firsthand what power a language policy can have, because so many people that we had been speaking Quechua with or trying to speak Quechua with before the law, suddenly their mouths were opened. They were willing to speak, they were happy to speak. Of course, there were many people, I shouldn't give the impression that nobody was speaking Quechua. There were lots of people that would speak, but there were many more that after the law felt that they could now, you know, make visible their Quechua voices. So that was a very powerful experience for me. That was preceded my graduate studies, but it really led to everything. I think maybe I'll stop there at the moment.
Yes, okay. That I think helps put in context some of your work. Let me continue with my short questions. When you look back at your career and the projects that you are engaged in, what you have done very well is you've told us various stories that you have learned. But I want to flip the question a little bit and ask, what is it that you would like to unlearn about all these indigenous language reclammatization? What is it that you would want to say, oh gosh, I wish I had never known that was a mistake? What is it that you would want to unlearn from your own experiences as a scholar, social activist, and all that in indigenous language revitalization? Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's
you see what I'm trying, where I'm getting at. I get you in terms of what you have learned, but what I'm trying to ask is there must be some other things that you think, in putting it bluntly, that were just wrong.
Yeah,
yes.
right. The longer I thought about your question, I mean, as I think about your question, I realize there's a powerful answer to that. It's very, I guess, not news to anybody here. But what I wish I had not learned was how deeply oppressed these people, all the people that I've described here, are and continue to be, and seemingly intractably so, because of the, whatever you want to call it, I think of colonial structures is one way to put it. Another way to put it is the evils of humanity, right? I mean, that we strive as we might to be good. And I've known many people who have lived their lives really striving to do only good and to not do harm. The human condition is such that it isn't happening. So that I mean, I wish I didn't have to learn over and over again how cruel people can be to each other. And I think, as you know, in my own work, I tend to emphasize the hope side, the people, the fact that people are so incredibly hopeful and powerful in fighting against that. But I wish that it didn't have to be that way. So that's the first answer that comes to mind, but you may be looking for something a little more, I don't know, precise. Or...
No. This is just an ongoing conversation. I mean,
yeah,
I'll hand over to other people. Yeah.
I would be actually really interested in hearing what others answer to that question. Actually, both questions. They're excellent questions.
Okay, then let me ask you the last question, then I will hand over to Edwin, because there are a number of other people who have put questions and comments in the chat box. Are you now, when you look ahead, are you more intellectually optimistic that we are on the right path, or because now you have the advantage of spending your time not being in committees, not being in all this. So are you more optimistic now than you were in the past about the role that scholarship can play? I can give you my own take about this, but that's not, mine is not important. It's you that people are interested in hearing about.
I would love to hear yours. I will try to take a stab at mine, but I really am interested in yours. So I think overall it feels quite cyclical. In the pandemic, in the time of when the pandemic hit, there was a lot of, for many of us, hopefulness at the reckoning that was happening. And, you know, the thought that maybe humanity really can change if we're all affected by a global pandemic, and we really can feel it. But then as time went on, again, the inequities became so evident of how people were experiencing the pandemic that I certainly, and I think others, lost a lot of that optimism. I'm proud, I don't know if proud is the word, but I'm grateful for the way human beings did respond in very generous ways, many human beings in very generous ways, but I'm sad to see us going back to old patterns relatively easily. In terms of scholarship, I guess at a certain point in our careers, we all learned that things we've been saying for decades are being resaid again and again, and sometimes said as if it's something new. But I think at least for me, I've also sort of reconciled myself to that, in that the world does change and evolve, and people talk about things in, maybe using different terminology and different, to deal with their reality as it currently exists. And they have to find new words and new ways of talking about it. But in some ways, some of the fundamental truths are permanent. And that, I think of people like Fishman, who, is not with us any longer, but was writing, 50, 60 years ago, 80 years ago, about some of the things about power, for example. Maybe he didn't call it power, language and power, but that's what he was writing about. And so I do think that scholarship is, I guess I'm overall optimistic because of the people, not the writings per se, but the people behind it and what they take, like the students who are coming after me or after some of us, the ways that they take scholarship forward to speak to new generations. I don't know how to say it, but but my answer is all tinged by the fact that I do recognize I am overall basically an optimist. I don't know. I guess I don't know how to be in another way.
Thank you very much. Yeah, there's so many other comments and questions, and I don't want to depress people by making them listen to me. I'll hand over to Edwin, and Edwin, take over.
Yeah. So we have a couple of questions in the chat box. I'd like to read some of them.
Okay.
Magda is asking the first question. So she starts by saying, I would like to ask two questions. To learn more about institutional or government support in Bolivia's ethnographic workshops, how was this initiative organized, and what financial support was involved in it? And what are your recommendations to organize such workshops in other Andean contexts? So to better understand the role of actors in implementational spaces in language ecologies, as those spaces are shared by advocates for different languages. Those spaces are also shared by global English advocates who, in Magda's experience in Ecuador, tend to dominate such spaces with powerful discourses regarding knowledge generated through English.
Thank you for those questions, Magda. It's helpful for me to come back down a little bit to some concrete examples. How was the initiative organized and what financial support? So in reference to the, it gives me an opportunity to say something about the Proib Andes Master's Program, which was the context in which the ethnographic workshop took place. And to give credit actually to a language policy arbiter in David Johnson's terms, named Luis Enrique Lopez, who was a sociolinguist, Peruvian sociolinguist, who has been my colleague and collaborator for many years. But he has and it would be interesting for somebody to do a biography of him, by the way, Sinfrey, because he has been able to negotiate both in Peru and later in Bolivia and later in Guatemala, and each one was at least 10 years of work, through the German Technical Corporation, the GTZ. The kind of funding and financial support that these kinds of efforts, like the program that I studied in Puno, the program where I taught in Bolivia, and the program in Guatemala, which I have less involvement with. So that the institutional support and financial, a lot of it came from the GTZ. But the key figure there is Luis Enrique Lopez, who networks, has a tremendous network of colleagues that he's built over decades throughout Latin America, draws on, you know, their intellectual and activist resources regularly. And I don't know, I guess what I'm saying is it wouldn't happen just with the financial support. It happens, there have to be people on the ground that are moving it along. And that's how those things happen. And in fact, he's the one who invited me to do the workshops, for which I think he paid the transportation. It's not a thing where you're getting, you know, paid to do the work, so to speak. To understand better. Oh yeah, the global English. So interestingly, that program also, Proib Andes, one of the requirements, so to enter that program, you had to have certification from an indigenous entity in your country that you were a member of. How was it? There were three things. Your government had to support you, your as a teacher or as a member of the Ministry of Education of that government. You had to speak an indigenous language, and you had to have some sort of support from an indigenous organization. Those were the three criteria to apply to that program to be a master's student. But once you were there, and the language of instruction was Spanish, but there were four thematic areas. One was education, one was what was it, language? I guess language was one area, education was one area, and indigenous language was one area. And the fourth area was like research methods, more or less like that. I think I've got it right. But what I'm getting at is one of the four thematic areas was indigenous language, and they did courses in their languages and learning about the, you know, the structures, the writing systems, in a multilingual space where there were speakers of multiple indigenous languages. So Spanish was still very much part of that translanguaging space. But what I'm getting at was also in that context, with all that emphasis on indigenous languages and indigenous identity, they were also reading in English, and they had intensive courses in English to support that reading in English, that scholarship written in English. And the library of that organization, which is one of the best resources still on bilingual intercultural education in Latin America, includes a lot of English language authorship, but not only that, a lot of Spanish and a lot of indigenous language. So that was something that I took note of and sort of thought about a little. It wasn't a big presence in that particular program, English, the presence of English, but the fact that it was there was definitely significant. Plus the access to internet, they all had email accounts provided. And so it provided both an international network access for them, but also a lot more English, global English. So all I can say, if you read the article I wrote about Neri Mamani called When I Became a Professional, I Consciously Became Indigenous. I can't remember what it's called, something like that. She talks about, I mean, what I'm trying to get at there is in that article, I'm trying to show how powerful was the indigenous identity piece of that program which the students really seem to work much more on than the question of global English was not a powerful presence there, is what I'm saying. It was a presence, but it was not a powerful presence. So I don't really have advice, but I certainly have seen it happen. And that's one of those things I wish I'd love to actually open that to others. What do we do about global English? Because here we are speaking English. I don't know the answer, obviously.
Okay. So Taboho also has a question about ethnography. And so his question is, early ethnographers like Boas, Malinowski, Brown created the theory of ethnography to study primitive people. And his question is, has ethnography since then been decolonized to reflect modern concepts of objectivity? And how can this theory be used without suspicion of its history?
That is a good question, a good set of questions. Part of the heritage of the social sciences in general, and anthropology more specifically, and ethnography more specifically within that. In some ways, this goes back to Sinfri's question about scholarship and the direction it's heading. Is it moving? Is it something to be hopeful about, or is it just repeating the same old cycles? I think that my answer would be that there is progress made in decolonizing scholarship in the social sciences, anthropology, and ethnography, and largely by welcoming in, or not welcoming, but inviting and hopefully encouraging and creating spaces for voices that are not the traditional voices of the academy to join that space. So ethnography being carried out by Indigenous actors, for example, one of the things that Luis Enrique Lopez had made a tenet of the Freud master's program was that all of the master's students did ethnographic research for their theses. The whole library of master's theses is available online, by the way. Because of that quality that ethnography has of being, it has the tradition that Teboho is mentioning here, but I come out of more of the sociolinguistic tradition that Del Hymes was one of the great minds behind. That's really about how ethnography is a democratic research process because of its attempt, or its whole orientation, its epistemology toward the voices of the participants rather than the scholars. So I guess that would be where I'd stop here, but it's an excellent set of questions. I think questions that we have to ask over and over again. And that my students, when they're doing their ethnographies, are constantly asking themselves also, as any of us who do ethnography, I remember many, many years ago at the Ethnography Forum at Penn, which was a research forum that was initiated under Del Hymes, actually, and which I convened for many years, bringing together researchers and practitioners, many teachers, many PhD students, doing ethnographic research in education. And one of the early speakers that I heard there was Henry Trueba, originally a Jesuit priest from Mexico, who then became a scholar in the US, a Latinx scholar that led what, the people that we know now were really mentored by people like Henry Trueba. He was way back. And then he spoke at the Ethnography Forum once and said that the quality of the ethnography depends most of all on the quality of the ethnographer. And so I've always held that sort of image with me, and the conversations with my students about, am I doing the right thing? Am I going about this right? Am I being sensitive enough? Am I being humble enough? Am I being respectful enough? that's the thing that I think makes ethnography okay, or maybe probably the best. Well, I think it's the best research method to use in our work. So that I would stop.
Okay. Thank you.
I'd love to hear some more voices. I feel like I've been talking a lot.
Yeah, there are a couple of questions, and then some people ask questions verbally, so we'll get also to that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Christine.
I'm in your hands. Whatever you want is fine for me. I just don't want to monopolize.
Yeah. Christine also has a question on missionary practices in Indigenous context in South America. So her question is, how did Indigenous modes of living and cosmovisions contributed to shape or reshape missionary identities? And how do you see the ambiguities of such histories that connected Indigenous people and Christianity? And she's asking this question because you witnessed missionary practices in South America.
Those are big questions. I mean, questions that are have been discussed at length too in the literature and in classes and so forth. How to answer them succinctly? A lot of contestation. And the answer to the first question about how did the modes of living and cosmovisions contribute to shape or reshape missionary identities? Contestation, I would say, comes to mind immediately because there's violent oppression, and there's many cases of violent oppression, but there's also many cases of contestation that does reshape the identities of the missionaries. So how do I answer that briefly? It's just it's a long history and a contested history and an ambiguous history, as you rightly say. There is no right or wrong, in my opinion. There's no one viewpoint that one can take in regards to the shaping of mutual experiences of missionaries and the populations that they worked with in their missionary endeavors. It's such a huge, and I mean, it's just part of human history writ large. That's all I can say. I would love to have more specific conversation, but I don't know where to begin. It's a huge, there's work, for example, on the chroniclers of the Spanish Empire that included soldiers, but also many missionaries who, González Holguín, Rosaline, if she's still here, would know much more about this than I do. I mean, she would call the names to mind. But there's so much ethnographic documentation that has been provided by missionary scholars over the centuries of South America. So things that would not be known today. And I know that one of the hats I wear is that I'm on the dissertation selection fellowship committee for a national educational board in this country. And one of the disciplines that this committee, we look at a lot of proposals from historians of education. And what was interesting in this round was that there were so many proposals where students are going back to these historical archives that are now more accessible in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia. Well, I'm thinking more in Europe, Africa, and South America, the cases I'm thinking of, where they're consulting archival materials to rewrite the histories from the perspective of the colonized peoples. Those archives would not be there without the work of the missionaries. So it's a very ambiguous terrain. Hope that's something of an answer.
Okay. Len Mario has a question, so I would like to.
Yep. Nancy, thank you for this. You've raised a lot of important questions, like especially language and voice and revitalization. And then you began with ethnography, and now you're coming back to ethnography. And when you began, one of the things you pointed out was that the ethnography seeks an insider's perspective. It is also mediated by the perspective of the ethnographer, him or herself, right? And now that we're talking about scholarship, and you rightly mentioned how Indigenous communities have suffered oppression and colonization, etc. Now, one of the things that bothered me when I was more involved in Indigenous education, and one of the reasons why I kind of distanced myself from this in Brazil, because there was a certain tendency, from my point of view, not to want to discuss how our perspective of education is actually mediated by a very colonial view of what knowledge is, knowledge being mediated through writing and through literacy, right? And so involving a certain image that the missionaries had, that when they didn't see a school or they didn't see writing, they saw an absence of knowledge, right? So I'm referring to, as you know, the distinction between schooling and education, right? And the reduction that we have seen in the last few years of Indigenous education becoming Indigenous schooling. And through this, the indirect reinforcing of the idea that outside the school, there is no Indigenous education. Outside written knowledge, there is no knowledge. And I kind of see, even though we have, you mentioned Luis Enrique's importance, the importance that he gave to ethnography. In Indigenous education in Brazil, we also gave that importance to ethnographic research. But then we have a certain kind of reproduction being done. So when we have our Indigenous ethnographers looking into Indigenous education, even from an ethnographic perspective, we have indirectly made them blind to the fact that there is education outside schooling. There is knowledge outside writing. And we have in certain Indigenous communities in Brazil where they have a right to the Indigenous school, and these communities see the school as being related to voice, let's say, and citizenship. So they demand their right to have a school, but in actual practice, they don't use that school because they have their own systems of unwritten education, right? So I'd like you to hear what your opinion is on how this, even though we're being ethnographic, how we may have fallen blindly into, when it comes to Indigenous education, into the conclusion that education is schooling.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for those comments and for drawing them out a little too. I know what I agree with you. On the other hand, what came to mind toward the end of your comments was the exceptions. In the master's program in Proibandes, I could think of at least two, I mean, there's more, but two came to mind, two theses that were specifically about Indigenous knowledge and education outside schools. So for example, one who did a study on the cultivation of the potato in this community and, talking to the participants and I mean, I can't give you the specifics, but I know the theme was the potato cultivation, and another that is on textile weaving. Now, the tradition of work in textile weaving in the Andes goes back a long way. It is true that the scholars are then turning those wisdoms, those knowledges into the written word, right? So there is that. Did you know that the Lake Titicaca, the Taquili, the weaving that's done on the island of Taquili, the beautiful fine hats that are made and so forth, that is in the UNESCO's World Heritage of Intellect, what does they call it? Intangible cultural heritage or whatever. So there is some recognition, right, of these kinds of knowledge systems that are not based on writing and on the schools. There's some work by a scholar in Mexico whose name I'm trying valiantly to remember right now. She's fairly young. If Magda, if you're still here and you're in touch with Francis, and Francis is also in touch with this student in Mexico who's working with, what is her name? She has a very English sounding name, but she's Mexican. But anyway, that scholar, whose name hopefully will come to me, is doing work in indigenous communities of Mexico. She has a whole project where she works with community-based learning, where the kids in the school are out and about all the time, talking to the members of the community about their different aspects of their knowledge. And she's a scholar who is so much dedicated to that work that she hardly has a chance to write. So I can't refer you to a lot of writing. So there's that dilemma again. But I don't know, I guess.
Nancy, actually, I'm mentoring Francis's postdoc. That's
right, she mentioned that. Yes, and and she would have loved to be here, by the way. She had some sort of meeting in Oslo where she is now that she couldn't get away, but she's going to watch us later, so she'll hear her name mentioned. In any case, thank you for that. That means a lot to her. That's about all I can say on that for the moment. So it's another tough one. I came on this program knowing we would face some tough questions, so.
Yeah. Cecile also has a question, and her question is, to what extent should we believe in the transformative power of education when the colonial capitalist structures are still shaping Indigenous people's lives?
What other alternatives do we have? Sometimes I feel that even in this country, the whole education system should just be taken down. I mean, Ivan Illich said it, right? Deschooling society. On the other hand, my whole life, my whole working career has been in education, and I can't imagine any better arena that I would have liked to be in to try to make the world a better place. The people that I meet, the people that I work with, the people that I teach, to me, offer a lot of hope of transformative power. But fundamentally, to change the colonial capitalist structures of our existence would be the answer for sure. I don't know how to go about, I don't even know how to begin to do that. So I would rather believe in the transformative power of education and work with those who are trying to do that. That's my answer.
Maybe we can start by believing that we can change these structures, actually.
Oh, what a nice answer. Yours is a much better answer than mine. Although I did at least say I can't imagine anything I'd rather be doing. So maybe that's my way of saying the same thing.
Yeah. And then Michael Scott also has a question about your experience with language revitalization and Indigenous education. So Michael Scott says your response to Dr. Makoni's query with regard to what got you started in this lifelong exploration resonated with him personally. He grew up as an offspring of a white North American Protestant educational mission. basically as missionary progeny. Michael Scott's own trajectory propelled him into the field of development studies and international humanitarian assistance work. A colleague of his in Bangladesh memorably once said that we Northern Expatriate Development Agency personnel in the Global South fell into one of the three categories: missionaries, misfits, or mercenaries. If we are to look at language revitalization and indigenous education through such a lens, what alternative might exist to these awkward categories?
Great question. Over the years, as I've done this work, and more as I visited or was invited to visit contexts like New Zealand and Sapmi and places and South Africa, where I didn't know any local language and couldn't manage to learn it. When I first started research in Philadelphia in the Puerto Rican and the Cambodian communities, my goal was to learn Khmer so I could work with the community there, as well as Spanish in the Puerto Rican community. And, you know, being an assistant professor on the tenure track got in the way, and I never did manage to learn Khmer. And then much later, as I was visiting, as I said, these other contexts where I didn't know any local language and nor very much local history or culture, I had to think long and hard about what kind of role was I playing. And, you know, I certainly didn't want to be missionary, misfit or mercenary. And what I came to realize, and one of the reasons I told stories today, is that what I had to offer in those contexts and what people were inviting me to hear, I mean, why they invited me, was sort of basically two things, well, maybe three. I usually think of it in terms of two. One was my ethnographic toolkit, which was the ability to listen and to try to report back or tell back in some way what I was hearing to people who, I've always believed that local people have the answers to their own situations and problems and challenges. But my role was to listen and try to, you know, say back to people what I was hearing. And part of my doing that was to also, as I said earlier, draw on that conceptual toolkit that I had and had been developing over the years to do that. But also, so one thing was this ethnographic toolkit, listening ear. But the other thing was the stories themselves from other places, other people, other times, who were the stories of the same kinds of struggles, the same kinds of victories at times, same kinds of hope or oppression. And those two things, I guess I see myself not, hopefully not in a missionary, misfit or mercenary category, but as a, well, one word that comes to mind is, what was I just going to say? I've talked about it in terms of bicultural and bilingual or multilingual, multicultural person, intercultural emissary, maybe intercultural emissary. So that, to me, that's what it's about. But I do believe strongly, and I've said this many times to my students, that we need people who cross boundaries. We need sensitive people, listening subjects that actually work across boundaries, that don't just stick within their own world, their own comfort zone. So that's what's impelled me to continue doing it, rather than to say, oh, I don't belong there. I'm not of that, you know, I'm not of that ethnic group. I'm not of that race. I'm not of that history. But instead to say, to embrace that and say, you know, we need these people that try to communicate across. So maybe, what did I say? Intercultural emissary might be my term for that.
Another colleague of mine once came up with a term in French, accompaniment, accompaniment.
Yes, 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 that's a good one. You're right. That is a very good one. In fact, I've seen that used maybe by my PhD students, I think, is where I first saw that. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Accompanying the other in this walk of life, right? We can say these things when we get to be over 70.
Not there yet.
Okay. Desmond has a question. Desmond, you can ask your question.
Thank you. I was just still trying to articulate my thinking here, but Professor Hornberger, thank you for the work you've done over the years. And I should recognize that, you know, your works were among the early works I started reading in graduate school that helped shape my thinking over the years. So I really appreciate the opportunity to engage with you here again in this forum. And I have two questions, one that is directed to you, but perhaps even to others. And the second one that I'm hoping will be a request for insight and wisdom from the many people gathered here. That's something that's very dear to my heart, and I don't have an answer to yet. But my first question is, I wonder how we can continue to justify the use of indigenous as a category, recognizing that it was precisely this practice of categorizing, including as indigenous, that is the making of the indigenous versus not indigenous, or the European versus non-European, the barbaric versus the modernized, that way of categorizing people that is at the heart of the colonial exercise. And I said that recognizing that there are many people who would be very eager to get rid of those categories precisely for the purposes of continuing coloniality. I just learned about a school here in the US, for instance, that in this recent anti-CRT movement was revising history textbooks and called Native Americans the first immigrants in the US, essentially trying to highlight that everyone is an immigrant. But of course, remember, just yesterday we were having a conversation about the fact that human beings are a migrant species. So there seems to be this antinomy in the ways that we think of the indigenous that sort of necessitates doing that, but also recognizes that categorizing people as indigenous is at the heart of the colonial logic. So how would someone in our position engage with that practice of categorizing as indigenous without opening the room for the perpetuation of the colonial engagements? My second question has to do with, you know, how people can engage with anthropological, also ethnographic work if they can identify as members of a particular community. So they have an insider perspective, but also they are members of the academia that have learned some of the bad habits of, you know, the coloniality of knowledge. So how can you wrestle with this? And I will elaborate on this a little bit more because this is an advice I'm seeking about something I'm personally involved in right now. But, you know, perhaps we can just start with that question of the indigenous, and I continue to struggle with that.
Yeah, thank you. Those are both really, really excellent questions. About the first one, the problem of categories. I first met Sinfree when you were working, or through writing, not in person, when you were working with Alistair on the book that you published in our book series called is it Deconstructing Language or Reconstructing Language? I can't remember anymore, but it was a groundbreaking volume, which, as you all know, was about 2007 or something. And so deconstructing indigeneity too. I mean, you know, these categories and terms that we have used and that the colonial experience engagements have created and perpetuated, we struggle against them, right? We, if for the very reasons that you're saying, one of the thing about the word indigenous really came home to me when I was spending that time in the master's program in Bolivia, where the students arrived at the program really, that's why the title of that article I wrote is I Became Indigenous When I Became a Professional, because she never thought of herself as Indigenous. She thought of herself as a bilingual educator, an intercultural bilingual educator from a Quechua-speaking community, maybe. But even that, from a Quechua-speaking community didn't come till later in her school life, right? She was just a person. So the process of becoming Indigenous and taking hold of that label for these educators was a significant process, and one that they talked about at length. And they saw it as a strategic adoption, right? And enabling them to engage also worldwide with other Indigenous educators. So there are all those strategic aspects that you were referring to when you were saying, you know, you're aware that people want to strip those terms in the interest of reimposing colonialist practices. So it seems to me that we need to use those terms, because we need to be able to. The same with language. We find ourselves hopelessly needing to use the language names, because they are categories that exist they're analytical categories, let's put it that way, in a world that is not chopped up that way. The world is, the reality flows, but we analyze things, and especially in scholarship, we talk about them with categories, don't we? I guess I would vote, though, for not getting rid of the term at the moment, but to continue to, you know, talk about these and worry about these things. That sort of leads to your second question also. How does it lead? Somehow in my mind, it was leading to the second question. About being a scholar, bringing with you the baggage of scholarship to your inside ethnography, right? And how you are no longer just purely an inside ethnographer. And Frances is someone who also thought about that a lot in her work. And Aldo Ansures, another recent PhD student of mine who's Mexican, not Maya speaking. Frances actually has Quechua heritage and has learned Quechua in her process of becoming a researcher, which is a whole nother story. Aldo does not have Maya heritage, but he immersed himself in an Indigenous community in the Yucatan. And both of them, though, have this quality of being insiders, at least from the community's perspective. They're seen as, you know, of their own nation, at least. And they've also, this awareness that they are bringing with them these perspectives and frameworks that they've acquired through schooling and through now higher education. I can also probably think of a few things that I could refer you to read on this, not by me, by others. So there's been some, you know, that insider-outsider dilemma, and the consensus certainly among ethnographers is that that both are excellent, you know, that we really need both kinds of ethnographers, but the struggle of being one, I guess, is what you're thinking about. Anyway, that's all I'll say at the moment. Hopefully some others will chime in.
Yeah. So
if it is possible, I would truly wish to hear others who have a thought on this to chime in. And if I might just say a little bit more about that second question. I'm working with a group of scholars at a university in Nigeria as in preparation for the Carnegie African Diaspora Fellowship that I have accepted to do later this year. And part of the question we're wrestling with is, we all are from this part of the country. We all recognize how we've been led astray by our by our Western, training and PhD process and, life in the academia. And beginning the conversation from the question about who our audience is, for instance, just radically changes the way you can think about what scholarship means. because I can't justify going there anymore with a notepad or a voice recorder to gather information that I then come back to the US to process and publish, right? So what does ethnography mean if you change who the audience of the ethnographic product is in the long run? Can ethnography even be extractive, or are you talking now just about engaging in ongoing conversations with people that you might not be in conversation with previously? What does that look like? Are there still any possibilities of connecting that to anything that looks like academic scholarship? I think I can go on and on about how this affects different methodological practices or even epistemic frameworks that we bring to the field. But I would truly appreciate hearing, the getting from the wisdom of everyone here, Cecile, Limario, sorry for calling you by names, but everyone here, if you have a thought, that would be great.
And I'll just say, while people warm up, that John Jackson from the University of Pennsylvania and also Francis both made sort of pondered some of this in their work because of the role of social media, right? And the visibility that you can acquire if you're also in social media contact with the people that you're working with. So anyway, I'll just stop there, but we can come back to it if there's more time. But the audience of the ethnographic product made me think of that social media aspect. Sorry.
So we'll continue with the conversations, but we want to end the recorded session here. And so I'd like to hand over to Vishnia to announce the speaker for next week, and then we'll formally end the session and stop the recording.